on swole. Put it up fancy. Big big bow, pockets on swole.
You may be familiar with the concept of fight or flight. It's the deep, cutting, physiological response to supposed danger or perceived threats. An immediate and dire choice to confront the danger before you or to flee it completely. Our ancient ancestors ingrained this subconscious physiological reaction into our human nature through thousands of years of evading predators as they lived in an unexplored and uncharted Earth. For them, failing to respond quickly enough was the difference between life and death. For us, things are a lot more mundane. In our safe and sanitized contemporary culture, what we perceive to be threats are much less physical than they are psychological. In a life where your physical needs are more or less accounted for, it leaves the greatest threat to your existence to be your own thoughts and how you perceive yourself. A completely different kind of self-preservation. Which brings us to Porter. In his relatively brief musical career, Porter Robinson has released 2 bodies of work that explore the concept of self-preservation through this fight or flight archetype. It was a long 7-year gap between Worlds and Nurture, but that time between albums proved to be crucial to the bigger picture that Porter would end up painting in his music. Nurture is the antithesis of Worlds, and understanding the experiences that led Porter to each of these respective projects helps us understand Porter more fully as an individual. But perhaps more importantly, it enables us to more fully understand ourselves and how we react to our perceived threats. Porter Robinson, an electronic music icon who for about 12 years now has been a staple within the electronic music sphere. Despite being so worshipped within specifically the EDM community that he rose to fame in, his musical catalog is fairly diverse, each project sounding totally different than the last. In fact, it'd be a tad unfair to label him an EDM artist, but it's within that genre specifically that he built his name and reputation. And despite having such a heavy influence within the space he exists today, he wasn't always particularly musical. It wasn't really even until his early adolescence that he began showing any interest in music at all, and it's because of one very important catalyst that Porter Robinson would grow up to be the world-famous musician that he is today.
DDR Max. Let's max.
At the impressionable age of just 12 years old, Porter's brother brought home a copy of Dance Dance Revolution for the PlayStation 2, and it seems that that game single-handedly unlocked some latent desire within Porter to learn and create music himself.
Dance Dance Revolution actually unironically super changed my life. And it just like something about it, like I would just be up there in that room for hours and hours and hours playing. It was my first time hearing Japanese music. It was my first time like hearing electronic music. So I downloaded like some preliminary music production software and I was like, wait, you can like change it.
This realization was the true inception to Porter Robinson the musician. Enter Echo Wraith.
Hands up in the air.
I remember being like 15 years old and telling my dad I had gotten a record deal in Germany and I was going to get paid 500 euros to put out a vinyl of this track that I made called Booming Track. And my dad just being like, okay, like that's really weird that this is happening for you in Germany. But like then the check came through and he was like, I guess this is real.
Echo Wraith is one of the several names that Porter went by in his early musical career. And though it wasn't the first artist name that he made for himself, it was certainly the one that helped him gain the greatest amount of traction at the start of his career.
You know, I feel like a lot of the people who are getting into electronic music now, they see these like DJs on the main stage and they're like, oh, I want to be that. And for me, it was never, ever that. It was never about performing live. It was never about DJing. I was just trying to like make music that sounded like the stuff that I liked.
And thus the beginnings of Porter's career as a DJ. Not really out of passion for the art itself, but really more out of chance. Simply accepting fortunate opportunities that were given to him.
My origins, my roots are not as a DJ. I didn't go out watching DJs, I didn't go to clubs. I was seriously 15 years old in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, just at home writing electronic music for many, many years. I started getting requests to go DJ. And I was like, you know, this guy's like, I'll pay you $500 to come to Portland and DJ my party. And I'm like, well, let me learn how to DJ and I will do that for you. I almost felt like I chanced into it. I didn't follow this aspiration to be this big DJ. I just kept taking the opportunities that were being given to me.
Around 2010, Porter decided he would drop the idea of an artist alias altogether and begin releasing music under his own name. And with this change in identity, he released Say My Name, his first commercially successful track.
I made my song Say My Name, and it really resonated with people, and that's how things got rolling.
Electronic dance music began getting huge in the US thanks to genres like dubstep that started out as a kind of niche underground music movement in the UK, but had began migrating over to the US thanks to the appeal and accessibility of many popular UK artists. However, there was one artist in particular who was based in LA who was harnessing all of this forward momentum and taking it to a completely new level. Porter Robinson caught the attention of Skrillex. Skrillex was worshipped in the US. He was the torchbearer of EDM's mainstream popularity. And to this day, he is almost universally agreed to be a legend in the genre. Skrillex caught wind of Porter after Say My Name began blowing up on iTunes and Beatport. And in 2011, Porter signed a 1-EP record deal with Skrillex's newly formed label and artist collective, Ausla. The EP was titled Spitfire, and it was Porter's first major release.
We're starting a record label as well, called Ausla. Porter is my boy, and anything I can do to help him. He's a good person, and, you know, he's stoked.
Went live, Beatport crashed from the sheer amount of site traffic that Spitfire was pulling. At this point, Porter's momentum seemed unstoppable. He would spend much of 2011 touring with Skrillex and would continue to make valuable connections in the industry that would further propel his international reach. By 2012, Porter Robinson was a household name in the electronic dance music scene. In just 2 years' time, he went from some obscure bedroom producer posting amateur tracks to online dance music forums to being a world-famous DJ headlining festivals with Skrillex and co-writing Clarity with Zedd.
People may not know that Clarity, the song that Is it fair to say like Change Zed's Life was really a song that you were on too?
Yeah, Clarity was co-produced by me. It was supposed to be a collaboration between me and Zed.
We're working on a long overdue collaboration that's, you know, one part soulful, one part funky, one part beautiful.
Spitfire was an immensely important project. Not only did it put Porter on the radar, but it really established his sound. A sound that kind of became its own genre with a name that Porter even coined himself.
You coined the term complextro.
I did. When I came up with the word complextro, I was creating my MySpace when I had 0 fans. And I wanted to have like a nice, funny, cute little portmanteau to describe my sound.
Okay.
So complex, electro, complextro. I never intended for it to describe a genre or anything like that. But people started using it and they started describing glitchy bass music, particularly glitchy electro with it.
After only one EP and a handful of singles, Porter didn't seem entirely satisfied with this stylistic trajectory that he was on. In the second half of 2012, Porter released his single Language. Language introduced a more melodic and atmospheric approach to his songwriting. It was much more ethereal, yet it still maintained his signature electro house style. It was immediately met with high praise, and many people, including Porter himself, considered it to be the best thing he'd written up to that point.
Now, you told us back in Miami at Ultra that you wanted to move toward making music that emotionally affected audiences more.
Right.
Now, what have you done to manifest that since then?
Well, I mean, Language was the big one. That was sort of testing the waters, and the response has been magnificent.
I released a song called Language, which I felt was risky at the time because I had only released really bangery, like bassline electro stuff. And then this song comes out and is a little bit more sensitive and more emotional, and it became my biggest song.
Trying to tell us something, and these two singles were big hints as to the musical direction that Porter was aiming to head.
The first song that, to me, that was really deeply personal and made me feel something real, I think, was Language. And that came out and it did really well, and that was a moment to me that was vindicating, where I was like, I can make music that I like, even if it's risky, because at the time, you know, Language did feel risky to me because I had only been making like electro bassy stuff to that point. And maybe I should just write an album that is 100% exactly to my taste, you know, with no compromises, even things I didn't even think I was compromising on.
So what they knew me for was this raucous, awesome, like, party thing. And that's not really where my heart was anymore. And so I was in this weird place where, you know, by playing this music that I had kind of fallen out of love with, I felt like I was being dishonest with myself.
What if I just stopped making DJ music altogether? And that was the most liberating thing by far. I was like, holy shit, I'm gonna go back and listen to every album that ever inspired me and figure out what it is that I loved about that stuff. And try to like channel this all into something that's really me, you know, the most personal thing that I can do.
On February 10th, 2014, Porter uploaded a mysterious 10-hour-long video to his YouTube channel. This was the announcement of his debut album Worlds, a project that would end up defying everything that he was known for. It was a blatant and outright abandonment of his entire musical identity up to that point. Worlds was Porter's escape from a life and a direction that he didn't want. Flight.
There's definitely a big focus on an appreciation for this like sacred thing to me, which is the escape and the fantasy. This entire album was so much about escapism and fiction. The whole idea of the album, it's meant to feel like this very kind of beautiful, sweet, but kind of tragic escape.
Why do we seek escapism? Why are we so enamored by our own imagination and nostalgia? With the advent of the internet and the exponential rate at which technology is advancing, society has been steadily pulling more and more in this direction of leaving reality entirely and living instead in these synthetic and virtual spaces.
I kept finding that I was using sounds that evoked like this era of video games, like late 90s, early 2000s, like N64 stuff. And then in the art direction, I kept using these low poly 3Ds. That looks so cool to me, and that really touches me because that's what I grew up with. I remember when I first started playing around with the idea of using these sort of like N64 sound font style instrumentations of like Ocarina of Time sound and combining those things with Vocaloid, I felt like I had this palette of sort of novel references to fiction. And I felt like the angle that I had on it was taking some of that like indie music sound and incorporating this sort of EDM and video game soundtrack worldview into it.
Just a couple weeks later, he released the album's jarring first single, Sea of Voices. Sea of Voices was completely devoid of any of the styles or sounds that we were used to of a typical Porter Robinson song. Soft ambient pads, a gentle vocal choir, wind chimes. It was really hard to believe that this was Porter at all. It was at this moment that we as fans began to realize that the Porter Robinson that we all knew was gone. On August 14th, 2014, Worlds was released, and just like that, Porter grabbed us all by the lapels and threw us head first into this new world that he had been carefully and quietly been crafting. The album begins with Divinity.
That's the first song on the album, and I think it's the first song that I wrote that was really in the Worlds style. I felt like I'd kind of stumbled upon the sound of Worlds.
The lyrical content for much of Worlds was always certainly secondary to the atmosphere and instrumentals. However, there is inherent beauty in these lines, and the concept of never truly feeling alive is intriguing to consider when you think about how Worlds is primarily about escaping life itself. After a nearly 2-minute buildup, Divinity drops into a magnificent wall of sound, and we are properly welcomed into Worlds. It's such a perfect introduction as it capitalizes on so many of the sonic and thematic motifs that the album is built upon. The album's second song, Sad Machine, stands out a bit. Not only is it World's most popular song, but it's the only song on the album that has a clear-cut linear narrative.
Is anyone there? Oh, hi.
Sad Machine is essentially a love story. It follows the story of an artificially intelligent robot girl who has been living in complete loneliness for more than 100 years, only to be found by a human who stumbled upon where she had been residing for so long. Who survived implies that at some point there must have been some sort of inciting incident that led to the robot girl's loneliness. Perhaps some sort of apocalyptic global event that left her to be one of few to survive. A blinding light could be interpreted as either the physical light of this unknown disaster or the metaphorical light of the human who found her and took away her loneliness that she'd been feeling. The girl who slept 100 years has something after all, and that something is companionship. It's love for this human. The tragic twist to all of this is how painfully temporary her joy will be. The unfortunate disconnect between a robot girl and a human boy is the human factor. The inevitability of mortality will one day leave this girl alone once again. It seems that she's forever destined to be a sad machine. Not bound by mortality, she'll live on remembering the life she had with those before her, those who are now gone. Life, love, and companionship that's now lost. Living forever in her loneliness and never truly knowing who or what may lie ahead. World's entire track list is filled with songs that channel our nostalgia and our seeking for escapism through fictional characters, memories of childhood, video games, and imagination. Years of War is about imaginary conflict and playing pretend as a kid. Fresh Static Snow is about the idea that out of the billions of people in the world, there necessarily must exist some sort of best possible and most compatible partner that you will likely, tragically, never know.
There are billions of people out there, and you'll meet only a fraction of them. And the likelihood that you'll ever meet the person who would make you the happiest is just infinitesimal.
Natural Light is a brief instrumental interlude that paints a more dark and melancholy tone. Lionhearted was literally written about the video game Space Invaders.
This is like an album that I felt like was trying to express the beauty I found in exploring fictional universes and how meaningful like books and movies and fiction can be, and it was all through this sort of indie pop lens.
Every ounce of Worlds takes you out of reality and into somewhere else, whether it be memories of the past or in another world altogether. That said, Fellow Feeling is a track that provides a brief glimpse into reality, Porter's reality.
At the time, I was very like EDM and like, like I just want to be known for this other thing.
To me, Fellow Feeling stands for, I wanted people to kind of feel what I felt.
Hear what I hear.
When it came to like aggressive electronic beats and, where my head was at that time, how that music was making me feel. I was really frustrated.
In other words, Fellow Feeling is Porter lashing out. The messy, off-meter bass hits contrasted with the beautiful and lush strings creates an interesting musical dichotomy that represents the internal negative feelings Porter had about electronic music at the time. It provided the opportunity for Porter to take out all of these negative feelings about his environment and channel them straight into his music, showcasing a full display of raw emotion.
To me, the second half of the song is more of a reference to like Language and Easy, earlier songs of mine. And I wanted to show that I could write this like big, loud, melodic music at 128 BPM, that was still who I was, and that fit with my new vision. But this idea of just writing heavy, aggressive beats for the sake of it was, I feel like I was just expressing some like violence towards that idea.
Worlds closes out with an emotional and bittersweet fan favorite that hones in on all of the motivic development that's been bubbling over throughout the course of the album. Things like fiction, nostalgia, existing in a world that isn't your own, escaping to a world that we create within ourselves. Worlds concludes with Goodbye to a World.
This notion of world destruction, of a world disappearing is really dear to me. I've talked about it in interviews before, but I was very much attached to these online worlds, and the thing about these games is that when an online role-playing game that millions of people are connected to goes away and the servers shut down, it's not like other games. Once those games are gone, those worlds that you very much immersed yourself in are gone. That's why I think the whole idea of like a beautiful apocalypse is really evocative to me. This isn't a zombie death thing here. This is like pretty, you know, this is a beautiful world kind of disappearing in a clean way.
Something very nice to me about this idea of everything closing off and in a pretty way. I'm obsessed with this idea of like vastness, and there's nothing more big than like the end of the world.
I don't think that Goodbye to a World is about losing everything. Rather, it's about loving what you had and your ability to create something new. It's about being thankful for the world you were able to live in, if not only for a brief moment in time. Fortunately for all of us, Goodbye to a World wasn't the end of the World's era. In 2015, Porter released a remix of Nero's The Thrill that scratched all of the same itches that Worlds did. And a year later, in August 2016, in collaboration with Madeon, we were graced with Shelter. However, a perhaps lesser-known inclusion in the World's era discography is Shepherdess, a B-side on the Lion-Hearted 7-inch vinyl record exclusively distributed through the quickly sold-out and now hard-to-find limited edition World's box set. Written in 2012, it was allegedly intended to be included in Worlds, but was axed last minute for one reason or another. Probably because of the dance-driven beat and hard-hitting drop in the second half that didn't quite fit the tone of Worlds. The song didn't really get that much attention, but in 2016, it began appearing in Porter's live sets. This time with a variation in production and a new name.
She heals everything.
I personally believe that She Heals Everything epitomizes why Porter Robinson is such an incredible songwriter. The honesty and vulnerability in the title, paired with the emotional melody and synths and strings, it all comes together to awaken this innate instinct to find connection and companionship in someone, to love and to be loved.
I had chased after a musical identity that I was proud of for so long, and I knew when I heard this that this was going to be a signature that I was going to embrace and actively lean into, and that was a very good feeling.
So with your musical journey, do you see Worlds as a finished concept that's done and now we try and do something else, or is it a step on the journey, and the next thing is going to take those ideas further?
Well, I just spent 2 months on tour in the U.S. and I came home. I had 3 weeks off. I wrote music for 6 hours every day for 3 weeks, and I have kept none of it.
After that, this is how we get to nurture.
Gone are the days of simulated worlds, fictitious characters, imagination, and living in your nostalgia. Nurture is about life, nature.
I think nature for me is the stand-in for basically health. This idea of things being as they should be, like things being at this stasis point where everything's balanced.
I wanted the album to feel up close, and I wanted it to feel intimate. Like, I knew that like nature was a good representation of that, because nature is real and it's every day, and it feels like you can touch it.
Nurture is all about self-improvement and overcoming personal and mental difficulties.
Like, your nature is something that you can't change, and your nurture is a combination of the experiences that you have and the way that you're treated growing up, but also the things that you do for yourself. It's the self-nurturing thing.
It's incredibly personal to Porter's unique experiences as a musician, but really more so as a human.
I got connected to the idea of nurture because it not only evokes the idea of nature inherently, it also is about the things that you can control and the things that you can change and the stuff you can do for yourself to leave yourself and the world in a better place.
Porter shares his experience in fighting his personal battle.
When it comes to music, album trilogies are everything but often. A series of albums recorded by the same artist with the same idea in mind and sometimes released around the same time is very hard to find. There's exceptions, of course, like David Bowie's Berlin trilogy or the Songs of trilogy by Leonard Cohen, but even in those cases, the albums were released right next to each other and are pretty much only connected by their sound palettes. But now imagine a trilogy where someone creates a concept and revisits that same concept with decades between the release dates. I know, it sounds like an impossible idea. Impossible unless your name is Paul McCartney. The McCartney trilogy has to be one of my favorites in the history of music, not only because individually the albums are pretty good, I mean McCartney 1 is one of my favorite albums of all time, but because of how original the idea behind the trilogy is. Usually, the albums of a trilogy are released around the same time and are made with a similar lyrical concept and sound palette in mind, but that's not the case with McCartney's trilogy at all. The first album was released in 1970, the second album was released in 1980, and the third album was released 40 years after that in 2020. And I know that you're probably thinking, okay, if they weren't released around the same time, then surely they share a similar sound palette. No. They couldn't be more different from each other, so what is it exactly that makes this 3 albums a trilogy? Well, it's the fact that performance, instrumentation, songwriting, and production is made by Paul McCartney. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's the truth. Paul McCartney is in charge of every detail in these albums, with a few exceptions. George Martin helped with a few songs in McCartney 3, and Linda provided backing vocals in McCartney 1, but for the most part, Paul McCartney is the only mastermind in this entire project, and I think that's amazing. It's an incredible feat that only shows that he's a genius, not only when it comes to songwriting, but also producing and performing. And since recently I put myself through the suffering of listening to John Lennon's unfinished trilogy with Yoko Ono, I said why not make a video about a trilogy that I like a lot more, and that is exactly what we're going to do today.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
4 times.
Now, I have to be honest, even though McCartney 1 is one of my favorite albums of all time, I'm pretty sure that your first listen of the album is not going to be that positive, especially if you just came out of the Beatles discography and are hoping for a similar level of quality in the production and in the recording and the overall songwriting of the record. I mean, half of the songs here are instrumentals. I remember the first time I heard this album, I was 15, maybe 16. I was living in South America, so I didn't have Apple Music or Spotify. I didn't have the money to buy the vinyl, so I had to search for the songs on YouTube and make a playlist in the order of the album. That's how I heard music back then. And the first time I listened to the record, I thought I had the wrong version of the album. I thought I was listening to the demos. I thought I was listening to the instrumentals because I couldn't believe that Paul McCartney, you know, one of the greatest songwriters of all time, one of the leaders of the Beatles, had put out such an unfinished album as his debut. Especially when you consider the fact that John Lennon that same year released Plastic Ono Band and George